and could I say good evening and a very warm welcome to our webinar about becoming and being effective as a charity trustee. An especially warm welcome to those involved in livery companies across the city, be that liverymen, apprentices, and others. And particularly, it's nice to see somebody here this evening from the Guild of Young Freemen. You are all most welcome. My name's David Locke. I'm a past master of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, and I chair the Education Committee. And it's been my pleasure to work with Stephen Gilbert, Chair of our Charitable Trustees, Shirley Creed, a trustee and liveryman, and Penny Wilson, CEO of Getting On Board, in producing this webinar. Getting On Board is a charity which works on trustee recruitment and diversity. It supports individuals to become trustees and charities to recruit trustees. It has a particular emphasis on making trusteeship more accessible so that charities can recruit trustees from all pools of talent and experience in society. You can read more about them at their website, which is gettingonboard, all one word, .org. For those of you who are not aware, the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators is the modern livery company that leads on governance. It's part of the financial services group of companies, and it advises that group and the city team on governance matters. It works very closely with the Chartered Governance Institute. Those introductions done, why is this event important? Well, charities are becoming more important. They're playing a larger role. To be fully effective, they need to be well led and governed.
Oh, wow. What a difference.
It's better if they are governed by a diverse group of people, which reflects the community in or with which they are working. That diversity is not yet in evidence across the charity sector. And a reason for that is that people have perceptions about charity governance which put them off, but which don't align with reality. In fact, getting involved with the governance of a charity can be one of the most worthwhile and rewarding things to do, both personally and professionally. Hence, what we want to do this evening is to share what is involved in charity governance and hear from a panel of people who are actively involved in doing it. There will then be an opportunity for questions, which we invite you to put in the chat, and we will tell you about a further event for those of you who would like to explore further whether it is something that you would like to get involved in. To start, I hand over to Penny Wilson, Chief Executive of Getting On Board. Penny.
Thank you very much, David, and it's lovely to see you all this evening. It seems entirely appropriate that Getting On Board is working with the WCCSA and the Charitable Trust of the WCCSA. This is, we're all about charity governance, so I'm really, really pleased about that. I've got some slides to share with you, which means I need to stop talking because I'm incapable of multitasking. There we go. And I want to start off by asking you to introduce yourselves in the chat if you're happy to. So please tell us who you are, what you do, and where you are in terms of your trusteeship journey. So is it something that you've literally never considered before? You saw this event and you thought, oh yeah, I'll find out about that. Or is it something that you've considered doing, but you're here for more information? Or perhaps you're already applying to be a trustee, and I'm willing to bet that some of you are already trustees. So despite the fact that this event is really for people that haven't been trustees before, our events always attract people who are already trustees. So do tell us, where you are in terms of trusteeship and what you're hoping to get out of this evening. So the structure of the event is you're going to hear from me for about 10 minutes. Then we've got about half an hour with our panel, which is it's going to be a really exciting half hour. We've got 4 people with really different experience who've all been trustees, some of them for many, many organisations with probably lots of war wounds. And then you're going to get me back for about 5 minutes after the panel to talk a bit about, practically speaking, how you apply to be a trustee, how you find a vacancy. And then we're going to pass back to David to close us for 7:30. Now, everything that we talk about tonight is really covered in this free guide from Getting on Board. We'll send you the link afterwards so that you've got that. So we've only got an hour. It's quite, it's kind of intentional that we make this introduction quite short so that we can attract people who kind of think trusteeship isn't open to people like them. And we want to tell you that you're wrong about that. But in order to get people through the door, we make it nice and short. And as David said, there is going to be a follow-up event with more support. So let's get straight into it. So what are trustees? There's 700,000 people who are trustees in England and Wales, and they are the long-term volunteers who are responsible for effective charity governance. The vast majority of trustees are volunteers. There are some exceptions, but they really are exceptions. So trustees are the most senior leaders within a charity. If a charity is big enough to have staff, the staff will report to the Board of Trustees. And charity governance kind of matters for obvious reasons, given the role of charities in our society, having well-run charities really, really matters. And it matters particularly at the moment. So last year in the kind of, in the bulk of lockdown, charities were seeing about a 40% increase in demand. So if you think about things like food banks, mental health services, education services, you can see why. And that combined with a 50% decline, a decrease in voluntary income. So quite difficult times for charities. So here are some facts and some stats. There are 168,000 registered charities in England and Wales, and many more charitable organisations. There's 950,000 trusteeships in those organisations because I mentioned 700,000 earlier. That's because about a quarter of trustees are trustees of more than one charity. There's 2,000 trustees appointed on average every week. And 90,000 is the estimated number of trustee vacancies in England and Wales, which is kind of huge. And of course, charities are all over the country. They cover pretty much any charitable cause you can care to think of. But there aren't 90,000 advertised vacancies, and that's something we'll come on to. So unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as just going and looking at 90,000 vacancies. So this is what the Charity Commission for England and Wales says a trustee is. So trustees have overall control of a charity and are responsible for making sure it's doing what it was set up to do. Whatever they're called, because they can be known by different names, trustees are the people who lead a charity and decide how it is run. I think this is quite a good explanation, actually. It's pretty straightforward. And you are an unpaid committee member. This also comes from the Charity Commission, this jigsaw piece puzzle. There's some really good guidance on the Charity Commission's website called The Essential Trustee. So if you want to delve more into this, there's a link at the end of the slides for you to do so. And although we haven't got time to talk through all of these tonight, I think most of them will come out through the panel. And I'll just pull out at this point the last one, which is to act with reasonable care and skill, because I think this one's particularly important for aspiring trustees, to say that the Commission expects you to turn up. So they expect you to turn up physically to meetings or online to meetings, prepared, having read the papers. But they expect you to turn up in every other sense as well. So to be familiar enough with the organisation to keep on top of what the organisation is doing. And they expect you to use your noddle, so to use your common sense. They don't generally expect you to be a total expert in charity finance, law, and charity governance and so on, with a slight exception that if your day job is charity finance, law, safeguarding, and so on, that actually they would expect a little more from you, because common sense dictates that you should probably know a bit more about it if that's what you're doing for your day job. So a few practical aspects of being a trustee. There isn't a set number of board members in charity law, and boards of trustees are typically 4 to 8 people. There are outliers in both directions. The largest board I worked with had 48 trustees, but that's most definitely an exception. Meetings, again, how long is a piece of string? But 3 to 6 board meetings a year-ish. And I think it's important to say that it isn't just about attending meetings. So being a trustee isn't just the meetings, even though we tend to focus on them. And every trustee's opinions have equal weight, which again isn't always how it feels, but that's certainly what the law says. So I'm going to run through a few myths about trusteeship. Now, these myths are really, really common. They're not just myths among aspiring trustees. Actually, they're really common myths among serving trustees, among charity CEOs, among charity staff and volunteers. And the first myth is that trustees manage charities, that trustees do the doing. And that isn't the role of trustees. Trustees lead charities, but there's loads of grey areas here, particularly in the majority of charities actually have no staff. So in those cases, trustees will be doing the doing because there's nobody else to do the work. They will necessarily also be actually running whatever services the charity has. The next myth, and this is a real huge one for aspiring trustees, is that you will join the board of a large national charity like Oxfam or Cancer Research UK. And the fact is that actually you can expect to join the board of a charity such as this random selection here. You can expect to join the board of a small to medium-sized charity. And the reason for that is that these huge charities are anomalous to the rest of the sector. Most of the charity sector is small to medium. So looking at some stats here, 3/4 of charities have an annual income for the whole charity of under £100,000. So that is why you can expect to join the board of a smaller organisation. And you should set your expectations around that. The third myth is that you have to wait to be invited to be a trustee. Now, 3/4 of charities are really struggling, say that they struggle to find the trustees they need. So we really don't want you to wait. We really would like you to apply. But actually, just a kind of a slight aside, many vacancies are never advertised. Across the country, still the most common way of becoming a trustee is by being asked. And that gives us quite a bad diversity problems on our boards, just as it does in other sectors' boards. So this is something that certainly we'd like to see change. So you can apply to be a trustee. The next myth is around time. Being a trustee has to take up a lot of time. Here are 2 surveys. One found that the average trustee took 5 hours a week to be a trustee and the other's 30 hours a year. So hugely different answers to what I think probably wasn't the same question, actually, because I think it depends how hands-on people are, whether the size of the charity, whether they're including their other volunteering that they might be doing for the charity. But I think the point is that as an aspiring trustee, you have some control over this in the application process. You have some control about how much time you say you've got and trying to match that up with what the charities say that they need. And if you do want to be a trustee, here are some statistics from the Daily Mirror. So they are definitely watertight. And this is what else you could be doing with your time. So this is just really to say that if you fancy being a trustee, we can carve out enough time to make it happen. The next myth is that you're personally liable if things go wrong. Now, the thing to do to keep this as a myth is to check that the charity is also incorporated, and you can do that via that link there. So if a charity is incorporated, personal liability is normally limited to a figure stated in the governing document, which is normally £1 or £10. And then my final myth, before we go on to our panel, is that charities should be grateful you want to be a trustee. And I'm being a bit facetious because actually charities often are really quite grateful. But the fact is that you get out of this just as much as you give. So 96% of trustees say that they've learned new skills by being a trustee. And I'm absolutely certain that 96% of people don't become trustees in order to learn new skills. 84% said being a trustee made them happier, that lovely boost of feeling that you've made an impact on a cause that you actually really care about. And I think hopefully some of this will come out from the panel. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see people more clearly. And while we get the panel started, please feel free to ask any questions. So put your questions in the chat, questions that you'd like to ask the panel, anything goes. So anything at all you would like to know about trusteeship. There is no such thing as a stupid question. If you're thinking it, somebody else is wondering it too. So please do put your questions in the panel. So we've got Stephen, Jess, Naomi, and Justina. I'm just seeing if I can see all of you. I can definitely see three of you. I can't see. Yes, I think I can see Naomi. So I'm going to ask you to very briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll get straight into some questions. So Justina, would you like to start?
Hi all, I am a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. I'm a current trustee and I'm also a Chartered Secretary in Financial Services.
Brilliant, thank you, Justina. Stephen.
Thank you. Like Justina, I'm a liveryman of the company. It's not easy to say the company. I'm also chair of its charitable trust. I sit, although I'm about to stand down, as the chair of audit and risk at the Royal Society of Medicine, and I have specialized for over 25 years in charities, both professionally, but also as a chief executive, volunteer and trustee of other charities.
Brilliant, thank you. Jess.
Hi everyone, nice to be with you. My name is Jess Bond. I am a liveryman at the Worshipful Company of Haberdashers, and professionally I'm head of outreach and widening participation at the London School of Economics. I'm currently a trustee for WAGs, not Wives and Girlfriends, but the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts. So we're the umbrella organisation that oversees 8 million Girl Guides and Girl Scouts around the world. And I've also been a school governor for around 9 years as well.
Great, thank you, Jess. And we all look forward to the other WAGs being established as a charity. Naomi.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy Bowman. I'm a consulting partner for KPMG. I specialise in advising banks. I am also a trustee of a national charity, a small but perfectly formed charity called MAX. It's actually our awareness week this week, so this is perfect timing. So MAX is a visual impairment charity. MAX stands for microphthalmia, which means small eye, anophthalmia, coloboma, and can't remember the other one. Microphthalmia, anophthalmia, coloboma, and then I think it's society at the end. I have a MAX condition myself. I was born with microphthalmia, which means I'm actually blind in my left eye. And I discovered the charity actually as a patient. And I'm actually delighted now to be able to use my skills to sit on their board. And I'm also a liveryman, and unsurprisingly, I'm a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Spectacle Makers, who also support opticians and research into visual impairment. So that's really how I've kind of made my interests and passions into my voluntary work. It's lovely to meet you all.
Great, thank you, Naomi. And Naomi, we can hear you loud and clear, but your video is a bit dodgy. So if you're waving at me, just to let you know that if you're waving at me because you want to answer a question, we might not know.
I may need to turn my camera off. Unfortunately, my connection has been rubbish for the last hour. So.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to start with a question let's go with Jess. So Jess, how and why did you first become a trustee?
Thank you, Penny. I actually first became a trustee in a previous role about 10 years ago. So when I was 24 at the time, giving my age away there. And that was for Girl Guiding Anglia, which, as you might imagine, is the regional branch of the Girl Guiding Association for the East of England. At the time, I was a volunteer, and I have been very involved with the charity since I was a youth member. I was a guide myself and then became a volunteer. And the trustee board of that regional charity was actually being reconstituted to specifically enable elected younger members to be part of the board. So again, what you were saying before, Penny, about ensuring that better diversity of the board. And so I put myself forward. There was an application process, an application form, and from that point I was then interviewed and invited to take up a role for 3 years. So it was a 3-year appointment. And then most recently, I was actually elected to my current trustee role at a virtual conference where we had 150 of our member organisations, countries around the world that are part of WAGS, that all elect trustees to the trustee board. Again, that involved an application form, a number of opportunities for virtual engagement with those who would be voting, but I think that's quite an unusual way really of becoming a trustee. So it did feel a bit like it was a political campaign at some point. So I'm quite glad to get that out of the way, but I don't want to put people off because I think that's probably quite unique to our particular charity, to be honest.
Thank you. And Stephen, I want to come to you because you've been on lots of boards. So tell us how the journey started. And then since then, what have been your experiences of how and why you've picked the boards that you've joined?
In some ways, I'm very typical because usually it's been because I've been involved in the community and therefore I've been approached. So the absolute classic, which I'm pleased to say they've moved away from, was I ended up chairing the Audit and Risk Committee because my predecessor was stepping down after 6 years. Good practice to limit that. And he was an accountant. And one of his partners said, do you know anybody who can take over to another partner? And so I was approached. And that's been a fairly typical pattern. What I was going to say, because it's something that's come up from one of the questions from Shiv, and I'm sorry, Shiv, I can't remember your surname now, barriers to people becoming trustees, it is this approaching. And the RSM was looking for what they call an appointed trustee, particularly with digital experience to help them with transforming the way they deliver things and do things. And they actually advertised. And I can tell you now, most of it is for free. LinkedIn, as we see, getting on board using all the time, and other mechanisms. And they've turned up a really, really good trustee. So I think what I would like to think is that in future, we'll see even the smallest of charities who've got no staff, no money, that they can find mechanisms where they can actually go out and advertise for trustees. And my route in, which is by knowing somebody, becomes an anomaly rather than the norm. Thank you. And Shiv, thank you for that question. And thank you to other people who've been putting really good questions in the chat as well. We'll get to as many as we can. So being as you've mentioned it, Stephen, let's talk about barriers to becoming trustees. Naomi, what do you think some of the barriers might be to people securing trusteeship or thinking about trusteeship in the first place?
Well, I think Stephen raised a really good point, which is visibility. I think it's a little bit like livery companies. They can feel quite opaque, and unless you know somebody who can explain the rules. Do you know what? It's a bit like partnership as well. It's just like the Big Four, just like partnership. You know, these feel like closed environments, and I certainly, from my experience, have often thought they're not for people like me. And also, I think age can often be a barrier as well. I think you can be perceived as too young. I certainly applied for trustee positions in my 20s and didn't have a huge amount of success, even though actually I came from a qualified chartered accountant background. You know, I was very keen. I had more time on my hands. I didn't have kids. I wasn't married, you know. So I think perhaps charities need to think a little bit more differently about how they can leverage younger people and how they can make the roles perhaps more attractive to those from non-traditional backgrounds. You don't have to be an accountant or a company secretary or a governance expert to add a huge amount of value on a board. But I do think that there are traditional qualifications and traditional roles, that corporate roles, that seem to lend themselves more naturally to charities. And I think that the other thing I would say is perhaps it's around confidence to apply from a candidate's perspective, thinking I don't have enough experience, when actually, Penny, when you look at the amount of vacancies that there are, I would imagine that the vast majority of charities who hear from any of you would be absolutely delighted to provide you with opportunities.
Yeah, and we'll come on to how you navigate some of these issues as an aspiring trustee. Like, a few of you have mentioned this is what charities need to do, but actually that doesn't necessarily help us when we're sitting there wanting to become a trustee. So Justina, tell us what you think some of the barriers, what stops people from becoming trustees?
I definitely would agree with everything Naomi said. I think even with my background in governance, I have found some barriers, and probably that's been linked to age. In that very narrow defined definition of what is a good fit for a charity, which I think as we're sort of progressing along the time, we're going to see that more non-traditional routes are going to be actually just as good, in terms of roles for charities. So I think when I very often have conversations with others in my peer group and circles and professional networks that have just never thought about how their skills are actually transferable to a charity, coming from corporate backgrounds, and they've never really considered that transition. Although, I've said to them, actually, I can see you doing really well on a board of a charity. So I think in some ways it is that visibility point, or just putting that up to people's attention to say, this is something you can go and do.
Thank you. And I think that's such an important point about us, those of us that are trustees, and I can see in the intros that quite a lot of people here are trustees. We shouldn't underestimate what a difference it can make for somebody to say to you, have you thought about being a trustee? You'd make a really good trustee. That can be the very thing that makes somebody do it at 35 rather than 65. So I think that's a really important point. Shivaji, can we come to you? You posed this question. I know you come with loads and loads of experience. What are your other thoughts on barriers to people becoming trustees?
I'm not sure I'd have asked the question if I realised I was going to be asked to answer it.
There's no safe space here, you're all in the firing line.
I suppose I'd endorse much of what has been said by saying simply that when I talk to clients about trustee recruitment, it often feels like there's a desire to complicate matters, that there are lots of complex problems that get thrown up and then explored. But actually, it's often as easy as a really straightforward advert, an honest description of what the role involves, and a genuine openness to see the funnel being quite wide at the beginning, even if you have to say a polite no thank you to some people who you might have wanted to join the board, but perhaps aren't quite ready. And one example that you've mentioned of where the need for honesty is I think quite important, is just the time commitment. I think you see an awful lot of adverts that suggest it'll be a couple of hours for a meeting here and there. And then you talk to people who've chaired a charity, or even just been a board member during a particularly demanding time. And the gulf between the advert and the reality is often very large.
Thank you. And before we move on from this, I just want to remind ourselves where we are in terms of statistics. So only a third of trustees are under 50, only a third of trustees are female, only 8% of trustees are people of colour, compared with 14% of the wider population, and that dips to 6% in the largest charities. And lived experience, and the experience of the very issue that the charity is seeking to tackle, is underrepresented and undervalued. So we're not in a great place, actually. Stephen?
Just one thing from the Royal Society of Medicine. This is a membership charity, and inevitably most of the board are consultant doctors, so they are older. But the trustees made a decision that they would reserve one place for a trainee doctor. In fact, there's a trustee who has fulfilled that role for the last 6 years on this call. And I think that's another thing that charities can look at to be quite positive and do something very definite to actually encourage and make space for younger trustees.
Thank you. I want to come on to, Robert, you've asked two questions. I want to come to your first one. So you've asked what currently makes an ideal trustee. Robert, do you want to explain any more behind that?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Well, basically, I think Justina highlighted the fact of the skills transferability, and really what I would be looking to do that going forward. I just want to know, and Shivaji mentioned obviously the time constraints and the honesty of that. So what do the organizations really want? There's been two specific professions here that I've heard tonight, and that's accountancy and legal profession.
Thank you. So I'm just going to take the bit about skills. So it's getting on board's position that there is a trusteeship for everybody. So this is, to me, it's a bit like dating, that we need to find the right match between what someone's got to offer and what a charity needs. But it's not just that charities need professional skills. So things like legal and finance will always be in high demand, and governance, but actually any background can be really useful. And I think one thing that charities, this is another way that charities can shoot themselves in the foot by being quite narrow about what they think they're looking for. So your job is easier if you come with a kind of identifiable professional background. I wouldn't want to be dishonest about that. I think it makes it easier as an aspiring trustee to sell yourself in. But let's come to the kind of the wider thing about what makes an ideal trustee, because I think it probably goes beyond skills. Jess, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. And I just echo your point there, Penny. I mean, when I started at 24, I'd worked at a university in outreach for a couple of years, didn't have, a huge set of kind of finance or legal knowledge. And for me, actually becoming a trustee has really helped develop all of that knowledge and skills that I can now take into my professional role as well. So it really is a two-way thing. I think for me, a couple of the things that I would pull out, first of all, our kind of commitment and conscientiousness. And I wouldn't say it's about necessarily being able to give every waking hour of your time, but being honest from the beginning, having those kind of open conversations about what you can commit. But I think being diligent, being conscientious, coming well prepared to meetings, having read the papers, having done some thinking. And secondly, I think there's something around good communication skills, particularly at the moment. I mean, I've joined a board in the middle of this situation where we haven't met any of our fellow board members. We're communicating across 10 different time zones. So we're getting up at various times in the middle of the night on a rotation basis for our meetings at the moment. It's a difficult time for charities, and it will continue to be for a number of years, I'm sure. And I think having that really good communication, having empathy, being able to be assertive and feel able to put across your point, but in a constructive way, and being able to take into account the diversity of perspectives of your fellow trustees, and sort of work together to come to those decisions, which hopefully in the main, you'll be able to make together using consensus, I think is really, really important. So I'll stop there and let others share, but I think they're the two things: conscientiousness and communication.
Thank you. And I'm going to come to Stephen now, and I'm going to ask you the question in a slightly different way, Stephen. So bearing in mind that you've been a trustee lots of times, what kind of trustee do you aim to be now when you join a new board?
Gosh, that's taken me back because I had a pre-programmed answer. So I suppose it comes back to the answer is to be a critical friend, with the emphasis on friend. And sometimes it's just a question of saying to those who are trying to drive the charity forward, are you sure you can do this in the time you've got available and with the resources you've got available? Because so often you see lots of enthusiasm, and that's important characteristic for trustees, but where you have staff with the staff, and they can get carried away. So to be able to say to people, and this comes back to the earlier point about good communication skills, to be able to say to people, just stop and think. Are you sure you want to do this quickly? Or even do you really want to do this at all? I think is one of the biggest skills you can bring to this, because it's easy to get carried away.
Thank you. And Naomi, I'm going to ask it to you in a slightly different way as well, just to get rid of all these pre-programmed answers. So what legacy would you like to leave when you leave? It's Max, isn't it? When you leave, how would you like to leave it?
So, okay, so Max Max is an interesting one. So Max was set up by parents of impacted children who, if you imagine Max conditions on a spectrum like autism, I'm on one side of the spectrum, and I'm incredibly blessed that it's just one eye and I don't have any of the other Max symptoms. You know, some of the children affected have heart, kidney, brain abnormalities, hearing loss, cleft palates. You know, it's a really sort of broad spectrum, and it can cause some really sort of long-lasting implications for children. So you can imagine it's 30 families a year, very close-knit community, gets very emotional at times because people are on the board have historically been representing their own children. And it's only the last couple of years where they have started to shake the board up and have non-parents on the board. So for me, the legacy is I have to, at the moment, tread a very fine line between respecting that legacy and respecting those parents and putting myself in their shoes and understanding how hard this is, but also remember that at the end of the day, there's a P&L, right? There's revenue that has to come in. There are commitments that we need to make. We you know, as others have alluded to, COVID has really hit the charitable sector very hard. And I would say for me, critical friend is an important role. I am having to play the role of gentle disruptor at the moment. So our board meetings are on a Saturday. It drives me mad. I have a 3-year-old. I'm 20 weeks pregnant with his brother. I don't want to be doing 3.5, 4-hour meetings on a Saturday. You know, I'm really having to challenge them and say, make your point, get your point across. Why are we bringing up certain, to me, very, very basic, very, very boring points in the board meeting when they could actually be resolved out of the meeting room? Let's keep it snappy. Let's try and drive decisions. Let's stop having this sort of debate. But it's a fine line, because you have to be absolutely respectful of other personality types. You have to be respectful of how different people learn, how different people listen, how different people make decisions. And I'll be honest, it's probably the most frustrating role I've ever done. But and I don't want to put people off. It can make such a difference, because it's a microcosm of the corporate world. You're always going to be dealing with different people, different ways of thinking, different, you know, and actually it doesn't do any harm to be exposed to that. But I think, to answer your question, the legacy is I would like to keep the passion of the families and of the family trustees, but I want to leave the charity in a stronger financial position, and I want to make sure that it's a corporate board, as opposed to running the way that it's currently running.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here about skills. So one is about, is a training available for charity trustees? Stephen, I'm going to come to you on that one. And then I'd really like to, I think it was Robert's second question, talk about some of the skills that you've picked up by being a trustee. So Justina, I'm going to come to you first on that one, but let's just roll back to Stephen. Joanna asked a question about, is it common for trustees to receive training? And predicting what your answer is likely to be, where might new trustees find help and support and training?
Right. In terms of induction, it does depend on the size of the charity, but there is guidance out there on what you should do even before you look at it, which is the due diligence side. And that, I think, from memory, is on the Charity Commission's website. So a little bit, if you're going to be a trustee and you've either had an approach or you've identified a charity, number one, you have to do your own due diligence. The larger charities generally will do induction, and I would say that it is some are better than others. But when you get to a very small charity, all by volunteers, they'll kind of have an informal chat. So it is very mixed. When you are looking at trustee training once you're in post, the vast majority of charities don't have, even if they've got staff, the resources to deliver that. And there are a number of avenues open to you. Many of the accountancy practices do offer free training seminars, and it's just a question, and some of the solicitors as well, of finding them and then just signing up. There are also, and I'm going to be quite shameless and plug the Chartered Governance Institute, paid for conferences, and I plugged that because on Wednesday and Thursday of this week, they're running their charity governance seminar, but you do have to pay. And if you haven't had enough of me by the end of this evening, I'm running a session on the impact of Section 172 of the Companies Act on stakeholder management within charities, which I'm trying to make interesting. So the answer is induction. Larger charities should be there, but please do your own due diligence first and look at what the Commission has to say on that. Smaller ones is going to be very, very informal. But apart from the very, very largest of charities, unfortunately, they will not have the resources to train you. So you'll have to look at stuff. But there's a lot of free stuff out there as well as the paid for.
And I think it's a real bonus that stuff is online now, isn't it? Because for those of us who aren't in London, all of a sudden, especially the law firm and the accountancy firms ones that were often face-to-face, now we have this world of training available to us from our kitchens, which is brilliant. So let's move on to the skills and other development that you've acquired by being a trustee. Justina, let's start with you. And I know that trusteeship you've got other board experience as well, haven't you? So feel free to draw on those other board experiences as well.
Yeah, I think a key one for me is that sense of stewardship and how that has, especially when you're dealing with very finite resources, it certainly helped me personally with decision making. When you've got to get to the crux of the decision, because there's a weight of impact of that decision. And it certainly has built my confidence in being able to communicate my point of view. If I have a strong feeling about something, having that confidence to communicate that within a team of people and mature the way that you communicate, because you're very often in a room of people that are very different to yourselves. You've got to learn the dynamics between that group of you. And so that sense of decision making and communicating in a foreign situation, that's something that's been developed for me personally.
Thank you. And Jess, what development have you acquired by serving as a trustee?
Yeah, I think again, I would just echo a lot of what has already been said. I mean, as I said, for me, I've been a trustee, for the last 10 years or so, and really that opportunity to get involved chairing committees, in becoming much more familiar with strategic planning, monitoring performance objectives, looking at annual accounts. They're all things that, in the first couple of years of my career, I never would have had that exposure to and that opportunity to develop. And I certainly think it's helped me to sort of progress professionally to where I am today, but also I think has really helped some of those sort of soft skills, I guess. It is about working with, a kind of group of people that you might not necessarily choose to sort of spend a lot of time with necessarily. And I think expanding that opportunity to work with people from different backgrounds, like Naomi said, being able to communicate, being able to work as a team and build that together, and thinking about how to negotiate and how to get your point across. Really interesting in a voluntary capacity, very different to line managing staff or even managing volunteers in a very operational sense. The other thing I would say, which again I think has been really insightful for me, has been that relationship that the board has with its chief executive, and being really mindful that as trustees, the role is a strategic role, as you said before, Penny. It's not about managing the charity. And for me, someone who likes being in the detail, that's been a good lesson to remember to look at the big picture, to be able to take that step back and to make sure that we've got that really constructive relationship with the chief executive, but we are actually letting them get on and do their job and feeling motivated and fulfilled to do that without having the board constantly nagging them about this, that, or the other, or trying to tell them how to do their job. And I think that's a really important lesson that you can, take into other contexts too.
Thank you. Stephen, a slightly different question for you. What have you found most difficult about being a trustee?
Dominant personalities. And this is the sort of thing you come across. We've talked about some of the soft skills. Don't forget, most of the time you're looking to reach a consensus. And that's fine if everybody's playing that game. I joined a small charity as its treasurer. And I went to a couple of meetings and then rang the chairman up and said, do you realize that every time somebody asks the chief exec a question, he throws his pen on the table? I was told, no, he doesn't, Stephen. And all credit to the chairman, because after the next meeting, he said, you're right. And it is that kind of dominating personality that can be a real challenge. It's down to the chairman to sort it. The problem is if it's the chairman who's being the dominant personality. And those are extremely challenging. My own solution was actually, I just ignored the behavior and I would plow on with my question, or alternatively, if I saw another trustee asking a question and the pen hit the table, I go, do you know what? That's a really good question. I wish I'd asked it. And gradually I watched the trustees come up. So this thing about not being confrontational, and you can achieve the end by very soft skills, and you do learn them by being a trustee. And just simply by supporting your fellow trustees is a good way to deal with any dominant character on your governing body.
Thank you. Right, let's wrap the panel up. Thank you for some of the practical questions that we haven't covered. There's a couple there that I know I'm coming on to, so I'm not ignoring you. It's just I know that we're coming there. I want to finish by asking the panel, each of you, for a tip for the aspiring trustees we've got here tonight. So a practical tip. We've got 2 minutes between us all, so it's going to need to be short and snappy. So is anybody ready to go? Wave at me, panel. If you're, yeah, Stephen, let's start with you.
It's very simply this. If you join a board, give yourself 12 months to actually really understand what is going on. So if your first 3 or 4 meetings in the year, you are a bit lost, don't worry, it will come. And always use time outside the meetings to ring up somebody that you get on with reasonably well and say, can you explain A, B, or C? But don't rush it, it will take time.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful tip. Naomi?
You're volunteering your precious time. It's your most precious commodity. Choose causes that you care about.
Great, thank you. Justina?
Yeah, I would say that ensure that the organisation is values aligned for you. So think about your personal values and what aligns to you in that.
Thank you. And Jess?
I would say don't be afraid to ask the difficult questions and do that in an appropriate way and at an appropriate time. But yeah, don't ever think that there's something you can't ask.
Great, thank you. And thank you, panel, so much. I thought that was really fascinating. I'm totally biased, but you were a great panel. Thank you very much. So you're going to hear from me for another 5 minutes about some of these practical questions about, right, I'm sitting here, I'm interested in being a trustee. Now what? Where do I find vacancies? How do I apply? So let me share my slides with you again. Okay, so first thing is to think about the kind of charity that you want to join as a trustee. And as I mentioned before, this is a bit like dating. So you need to find the match between what you've got to offer, what you're interested in, what your passions are, and what the charity is looking for. Having said that you need to find that match, I would say really don't agonize, particularly if it's your first position. It's only ever going to open further doors. It might be that in 3 or 4 years of being a trustee at charity A, you think, I want to do something completely different now in a completely different cause area. Well, that's fine, because now you've got even more experience. So don't agonize. And also, as I think we've already touched upon, see this a little bit like a job search. So do not expect to get the first one. If you're rejected, don't take it personally. That means that the charity has seen a better match in somebody else. And just assume that you're going to need to apply for several. You're going to need to put some time aside in all likelihood to make some applications. You'll need to be thinking about the causes that you're interested in. If you're not sure, then I really recommend you look at some advertised vacancies, because that can help you work out. Quite a lot of people say to us, "Oh, it really doesn't matter." But actually, when you get talking, you realise that are you interested in animals? Is homelessness something that really gets your goat? Is it, I don't know, the environment? Are you very interested in climate change or not so much? So actually, most of us do have things we're more or less interested in. We might just not have given it much thought before. You'll also need to think about the size of charity you might want to join, the stage, so new and whizzy and startup, or perhaps you'd prefer something that's a bit more stable, has been around a while. A big difference in being a trustee is whether a charity's got staff or not. That's going to make quite a big difference to how hands-on you are. And then potentially thinking about logistics. Now, the world has changed here, hasn't it? In that a lot of meetings are online at the moment. But if it's a locally based charity, you're probably going to need to live or have some kind of connection with that community. If something's more national, then you may need to physically get to the meetings. That might be a consideration for you. So that's what you're looking for. Then think about what you're bringing to the role. So you're going to need to get to the point where you can quite clearly articulate what you're bringing to the trustee party. Now, we're going to work on this more in the second event. So if this is something you'd really like some help with, look out for our email where we invite you to the second event. So here are some of the categories you'll need to think about. So education and qualifications, what you've done in your day job. So, your kind of day job skills. Volunteering, fundraising and campaigning. People often say, I've got nothing here. But actually, when you get talking and you say, have you ever been on an event committee? Have you been involved with school fundraising or the PTA? Or have you ever campaigned? Have you ever done a sponsored run? Actually, quite a lot of people have quite a lot in this box. Then think about your softer skills and qualities. Are you the person that always finds consensus? Are you the person that's fantastic at the detail, really data-driven, and so on? Think about your passions. So these there may be relevant things here, and that kind of is connected to life experience. So I think one of the questions in the chat was, do trustees serve for longer if they've got a connection through lived experience with the charity? And actually, the question we often get asked is, do you need to have lived experience in order to serve on a board? So does Naomi's personal connection with what Max does mean that, she's a better trustee than somebody who doesn't? And actually, no, you need both on a board. But if you've got a reason, a personal reason why you're particularly interested in a charity and you're happy to share it with them, then do tell them. If you're not happy to share, keep it to yourself. It's not something that you have to share. So unfortunately, being clear, being able to articulate all these things still isn't quite enough, because you need to see all of this through the charity's eyes. So here are a really common list of some of the challenges that charities face. Obviously, every charity is quite different. And in session 2, we can talk a bit about how you actually work out how you research a charity and find out what its challenges might be. So you're going to need to kind of tell them how you're going to help them with their particular challenges, whether that's in the application or interview. And the final thing I'll say on kind of articulating what you bring to this is that it needs not to be technical. So most CVs and work cover letters are written for a particular industry or a particular professional skill set. Whereas when you're applying to be a trustee, the person on the end of your application, they might be the CEO of the charity. And if they're any of the trustees, they could be anything from a head teacher to a social worker, to a banker, to a data analyst, to a marketeer. You literally have no idea who's going to read your application. So it's got to be basically understandable to anybody. So a quick whistle-stop tour of how to find trustee vacancies. There's three main ways. So first of all, you might already know the charity. So Naomi said she was a service user. Jess was already volunteering in the guide. So you might know them because you're a volunteer, because you're a service user, because you know people who work or volunteer there and so on. The second way is through trustee listings, and I'm going to share some websites with you. And the third way is the direct approach. So just going in completely cold and speculative, which sounds a bit bonkers to people outside the charity sector, but given that charities are often not advertising, that way kind of circumvents the fact that they're not advertising and goes straight to them. So here are some trustee vacancy sites. We'll send these slides out to you afterwards. The biggest single trustee placer in England and Wales is Reach Volunteering. So I really highly recommend you can just look at their vacancies, or you can get yourself a profile. It's all free. If you get yourself a profile, you can be found by charities, as well as receiving email updates when trusteeships come up that fulfill your criteria. So it's really worth doing. There's a couple of kind of I guess warnings here. So when you're looking at advertised vacancies, just remember that they're really, really skewed. So you're lucky because most of you live in London, I assume, or at least around London. So that's very well served for trustee vacancies, not so in other towns and cities in the UK. They're very skewed towards chair and treasurer positions. Advertised vacancies are also very skewed towards bigger charities. So don't think that when you're looking at advertised vacancies that you're seeing a kind of full picture, because you're really not. And you'll also find that often the advertised ones are more competitive, especially if the organisation's larger. And then finally is the speculative approach. So going in to a charity that you don't know and just getting in contact with them and saying, I'm looking to become a trustee and I think your organisation's work's fantastic. Are you looking for trustees at the moment? In Getting on Board's guide, you can find some text that you can steal to send off to charities. And I would say, you can go onto the Charity Commission website, look at all 168,000 registered charities, use the advanced search to make yourself a long list, and just contact 10 or 20 charities with a really short email saying that you're interested in whether they're recruiting trustees at the moment. So what next? Please come to our second event if you would like to be a trustee. Don't forget Getting on Board's free guide, which we'll send you a link to. Think about identifying causes, starting to become clear about what you're bringing to a role. Have a look at some vacancies. Prepare CV and cover letter. If you're at that stage, you can find some examples on the Getting on Board website, and make some applications. Actually, crack on and make it happen. And we've got a bit of further reading here, which we'll send to you. I'm going to pass back to David now, who's going to close us off. I hope we've encouraged some liverymen to become trustees and your guests. While David's talking, I'm going to post a link to an evaluation form, and we'd really love to hear what you thought of the event. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Penny, for that. Just a couple of observations and some thanks, and then closing. Firstly, one of the things which has struck me tonight is the diversity of people who have joined us for this occasion. And they range from people who are completely new to this activity to people who I see have a vast amount of experience. And you are indeed all very welcome. Secondly, the question was asked about training. And that caused me to think back a few years to the time when I was responsible for the Committee of University Chairs and their training program. And we were large enough to do a residential training session. And the first one I ever did was such a massive eye-opener for me. We had on the program a very wide range of people, They ranged from an extremely, let's say, unconventional, you might say risky, riskily dressed student to the then global chairman of Mercedes-Benz. And we had everybody in between, from the member of the union who wore one of those jackets that had a black leather patch on, to some frightfully well-dressed ladies with hairdos which must have cost a fortune. Now, the reason I tell this is I don't think I've ever worked with a group that had more diversity than that. But they were all passionate about universities and about higher education. And that passion and that diversity is precisely what universities need if they're going to be relevant to society and if they're going to be well guided and so on. And it all went along really well, and those people were indeed fulfilled. I'll just add one thing, if I may, and if I see Penny scowling, I shall have to withdraw it very quickly. In terms of why should you get involved? Well, some of the reasons why some of those people on that CUC event got involved was because they knew other people who were doing it. And they saw how those people were happy about doing it, how it was worthwhile, and so on. And they wanted to get involved. And it's probably a good thing in some ways if you know somebody else who is involved in that or another charity. So with just those two additions, I'd like to close by endorsing the request. Do look out for what's coming next. We want to look carefully at what you say on your evaluation sheets, and then we want to organise something which is ideally face-to-face, which will take all this further, and you'll meet each other face-to-face, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that too. But finally, I'd like to thank Penny and getting on board for working with the company and its trustees on this event. I'd like to thank Shirley from the company, and also she's not here tonight, but Karen from the company, who's done a lot of the administration for us. I'd like to thank Stephen, who's both helped put this together and serve as a panelist, Justina, Naomi, and Jess. But finally, I'd like to thank all of you. I hope that you have found it interesting. I hope that you've found it inspirational, and I hope that we'll have the pleasure of meeting you again at the second event. Thank you and good night.